Welcome back to Tokyo on Fire. 2 weeks ago, we addressed the issue of the Prime Minister reaching out to dynamically engage voters throughout Japanese society. So he is reaching out to single mothers, the elderly, people who are in the rural areas who don't have a job, who are retired. He's made a couple of missteps, though, hasn't he, Michael?
Well, we had in that one podcast or YouTube video, we talked about one specific, suggested appointment that had been made, which was of this very famous author, Otodake Hirotada, who is a handicapped person, a person who was born with neither arms nor legs, who toodles about on a wheelchair, but who has made a life for himself.
And he wrote a bestseller. He's a well-known author and very much a positive symbol for people who are different in that way. Mm-hmm. And we on this program discussed, wow, this is really something that they're really pushing it in a serious way, this reaching out to otherwise marginalized populations, marginalized people. For example, the appointment of Imai Eriko, the former singer from Speed, as a young mother with a child who has disabilities. That seemed as a potential candidate. Grooming.
And she's on the candidate list now. She's there. And so this seemed a logical step, especially since when you ask members of the Abe administration, what is this dynamically engaging the 100 million citizens? What does that mean? They now say it means being inclusive. Mm-hmm. To have a society that is able to take the strengths of every person and that no one is excluded. And that's what it looked like this was going to be the poster symbol of this effort. Looked like it was going to be Otodake.
Right. But one of the things that happened, and I'm cutting you off, I apologize, but one of the things that happened was now we're in this period of Bunshun and Shukanshi, checking out everybody and looking into every nook and cranny and under every rock and exposing things to damage the credibility of the Prime Minister.
And with the case of Imai, they found that her live-in boyfriend was running what is basically a prostitution ring. That hasn't really stuck, though it's quite an amazing story in and of itself.
Pay dirt.
And for once, it wasn't Shukan Bunshun, the weekly Shukan Bunshun, but it was Shukan Shinsho, its arch rival, which dumped the goods on Otodake. And what goods they were! An indescribable and unbelievable story that this person who has lived in the public limelight for his entire life has been seen and been on television and talks and on radio.
Inspirational speaker.
And is interviewed all the time, had a backstory that was absolutely flabbergasting.
So the magazine goes in, they send some investigative reporters, they dig it out, they present it to him, we're going to publish this unless you publish a retraction or you contribute in providing us news of this story.
And what happens is they publish. Mm-hmm. At the end of the day, they publish it. And it's about extramarital affairs. It's about 5 mistresses, according to this count. And rather than denying any, Otodake admits to it and somehow gets his wife, his long-suffering wife, to say that it was her fault. End of his candidacy.
I guess so.
The LDP immediately just said this was an idea. Somebody floated it. Whoever thought that we were never actually being serious, well, this is something that, whatever. Next story, please.
Yes. Well, we talk about this sort of thing, not because it is interesting to talk about. It is a kind of a microcosm of looking at Japanese society and the things that can happen. But here in politics, there seems to be a biorhythm when these things are really at their peak, and this is the period that we're in right now.
It's ever since the breaking of the Amari Akira story, the government has been fighting what has been a losing, retreating battle against the weekly magazines. A fight that it thought it had won back in the 1980s, that they were no longer the force that decided how the people saw politicians. But now, while we don't see the real effects yet in the public opinion polls having to do with support levels for the LDP, a constant stream, a constant avalanche of these stories coming out one week after another from the magazines that had been so they've been basically involved in entertainment scandals and things like that. For them to really grab the political microphone and say, hello, this is the LDP as it really is, that is something that we have to talk about. Because the LDP, for me, I'm saying, oh my gosh, it's the old LDP that we used to know. The one that got so hated by the people, they eventually, despite all of their advantages in money, in gerrymandered districts, pork barrel politics, despite all those advantages, managed to get wiped out in 2009.
Bad suits.
Everything. That seemed to have been buried in the first few years of the Abe administration, but since the beginning of this year, we've been seeing a lot of the old style LDP.
Well, it seems like these kinds of stories have to trickle out somewhere, and apparently the Prime Minister understands that too, as does Mr. Suga. So they put a clamp on it, and they have this secrecy legislation now where they can actually implement their will to people who are supposed to be telling through newspapers and radio programs and television what the news is and what's going on. And it seems like the Prime Minister likes to have a little bit more of a hand in that than a normal democracy allows a leader to have. So probably this shukanshi industry is seeing an opportunity there. And yes, it was not a trashy sort of thing. I mean, respectable people read the shukanshi because it has good information, very timely and richly detailed, and it seems like it is coming to the fore now.
Well, you see, I disagree in terms of the trashiness. I think it went through a significantly trashy period where from about the late 1980s on, television took up more and more of the political space. And it could report a lot of the juicy stories that were previously handled only by the shukanshi, because the newspapers won't touch scandal. They'll put it on the last page, what's called the shakai page, the society page, but they won't put it on the front and they won't put it in the first few pages. That's always been clean, and it still probably is. If you go to the newspapers today, they probably say it's even cleaner now. But television, with the wide shows, the long format news that we'd have from 4:30 to 9 a.m., they got to fill that airtime, and they filled it during the 1990s and during the millennium with scandal and
wackiness, a lot of stuff.
Wackiness, but also extremely anti-government critical material. That has collapsed. You just don't see that anymore. But that doesn't mean that scandal reporting isn't important, and it's certainly in this political season building up to the House of Councils election, it has really changed the atmosphere, even though it may not have changed the electorate entirely.
So why has it changed in the popular press and in the newspapers and on television? How come people who want to know what's really going on underneath the carpet, they have to go to the shukanshi rather than to have it in the normal press?
Well, in this case, it's simply that the normal press is very much a career enterprise. And a lot of times they're very closely allied either with the political parties or with individual politicians. We have famously condemned by foreign news organizations the Kisha clubs, the dedicated offices inside political parties or ministries where all of the members of the Japanese domestic media have their representatives and they live together with the bureaucrats or the politicians 24/7 and are constantly trying to get juicy bits of information from them, and they share it among themselves. They don't share it with the outside world. And it's a nice, cozy relationship. That kind of self-censorship, you don't want to ruin that relationship. You don't want to say all that you know. That suppresses the ability of the regular mainstream press to talk about scandalous material, to talk about embarrassing material, even beyond the new security legislation, which has put on a whole new layer of suppression on the mainstream media. That has left open the possibility for the marginalized media to pop up with these stories. And in this case, this broad narrative of the party and of Mr. Abe, this idea of dynamically engaging the entire populace, is falling apart. It's looking really pathetic. And that's not good for the prime minister because he doesn't really have anything else.
Right. Well, they could still dynamically engage, but it just seems like their selection set is a little bit off kilter. Maybe they haven't run.
Or simply there's
There is none.
No
Right.
selection at all. It's just everybody come on in.
Well, the House of Councilors also is kind of a collection of very famous, nationally recognized sports figures, movie stars, singers, that sort of thing, author.
Right. And that you are correct in that regard. But you have to have some kind of vetting process, and they simply blew it on the vetting process. And that's not the only place where they're blowing it.
Sure. Isn't this somewhat representative of what we deal with in Japan all the time? I mean, even with TEPCO, with the nuclear explosion that happened there, having studied what happened there, they said the regulators and the operator were in too much of a collusive relationship, and that seems to permeate a lot of Japanese society, and that's why maybe the free press has been recognized internationally in Japan as one of the lowest. It's not a free press. It's not a really, truly operating democracy.
Well, that I'm going to argue, I have a completely different view, but that's another entire episode.
Well,
but in terms of what this particular issue, the collusion that happens between mainstream media and the political parties and major politicians has opened up a space for the weeklies, which for a long time were down, but they're back up and they are punching well above their weight.
This is not over yet, is it? I mean, this is pretty dramatic.
This is over for this week.
For this week.
Next week, they have another edition coming out, and it'll be full of some things that you would have never imagined.
This will continue now for probably up until the election.
Yeah, and we're going to be seeing a lot of backpedaling on the part of either the ruling party or indeed the Abe administration, suddenly under assault, where for the first 2 years they got a free ride.
You can't study Japanese politics without studying the scandals that go on in the background too. Please stay tuned.